Hi, I'm Steve from Squawkbox. Before you start watching our main video this evening, I would just like to put a quick plug in for Early Day Motion 1321. That's EDM 1321. See the text below for the address for that. That's a motion put to Parliament by a group of Labour MPs calling on the government to cancel student tuition fees and debt and rent. That's EDM 1321. Enjoy tonight's video.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight, I'm really excited to be having a discussion about education. There's so much going on in the world of education at the moment. The way students have been treated is deplorable. It's obviously been a source of transmission of COVID. And we want to ask some of the bigger questions about how it's come to pass that the country is in this situation. So I'm delighted to be joined this evening by Jenn, who's going to set the scene for us. Rhiannon Lockley, I've also had the delight of knowing for many years. She works in higher education and is a left-wing activist, and two fantastic young student activists who are also leading the fight on their own terms to make changes where they are studying. So, Jenn, I'd like to go on to you first, if you can, because actually I want to relay a little story with you. I really admire your stance on student tuition fees, because I actually joined the Labour Party in response to a delegation to Nicaragua, where I was inspired by them literally fighting in their universities to not have tuition fees brought in, and they were the fourth poorest country in the world at the time. I just thought, wow, if they can do it, we can do it too. But not many people in the Labour Party took that position, did they? And I know you did.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Labour Party is a complicated animal, as we all know, and there are different points of view. But back in the 1990s, it was the Blair government, in all its pomp, decided that they wanted to reform public services generally. In a way, I can understand it, because if you're going to say to people you've got to pay tax to pay for public services, then the services need to be of high quality. The question, though, is how you achieve that high quality and how you persuade people to continue to pay tax. Otherwise, if the services are crap, then what will happen is the people who pay more tax will start voting for a tax-cutting government, and you'll end up with a Tory government forever. So I think, this is quite a complex political operation that needs to be done. But so I'll go that far with Blair. You want top quality public services, but I don't agree that education or health should be turned into a commodity. And let me just very briefly say, it was in 1998, I think it was. I was already an MP, and I had been in the Blair government for a short while. And then I came out because I could see it wasn't going the direction that I would have hoped for. So there are two things really about how you fund, about higher education we're talking about now. The first is going to university like a commodity, like going to buy a pair of jeans or a car or a house? Is it something which you as an individual buy from a provider, like going to Marks and Spencer's or Next or wherever you go to buy your clothes or whatever? Or is it something different? And of course, for me, it's quite clear. Education is a public good. It's for the common good. The higher educated the people of our country are, for all sorts of reasons, is an objective which we all should share. And so it's not a commodity, it's a public good, like breathing fresh air. And what I felt was that if you're going to provide education as a public good, it has to be paid for still, but it should be paid for by all of us taxpayers, contributing together, so that you go to university because you've got the skills, you're adapted and want to go there, and there's no financial penalty. And obviously it's a completely different relationship. When I went to adult education, which was paid for by the state, and then as an adult I went to university and it was paid for. Now that is not where Blair went, and we fought it a tooth and nail. And it was a big campaign, I can tell you, it was a big campaign. It wasn't the whole of the Labour Party, but the rebellions were not massive, but they made a big impact. And I was part of those rebellions. So that's the first point, I think, and it'd be interesting to see what other people on the panel, yourself as well, Jennifer, think. But there's a second issue about higher education, and this is where we've got to be careful, but we've got to face the truth, which is this, that in those days, university largely was for the middle class, but working class people were paying tax. So there was an argument to be made that the people who pay for the universities were as much people from working class backgrounds as from middle class backgrounds, and yet their children were not getting to university. But that doesn't require to turn the universities into a commodity, like the commodification of education. What it implies is that higher education needs to be set clear social objectives and challenges. And I know that most university lecturers and so on would want to do that in any event. So we've got to face the fact that that was an Achilles heel for the higher education. And the second thing on the same subject about class is that I represent a very poor community, generally speaking, lots of people in poverty. I mean, the fact that they've now got to borrow money to go to university, it's already difficult enough to get there. And the figures in my constituency are shocking, really, in terms of access to higher education. It really is unacceptable. But the point is this, and the point to Blair was, apart from education being a public good rather than a private commodity, you know, by introducing tuition fees, you're actually putting an additional barrier to those poorer families who want their kids to go to university and who are bright enough to get there. And of course, there's a debate about what happened as a result of tuition fees, but generally speaking, it's a further barrier to working class people getting into higher education. So I think this is a complicated debate, but in the end, it's quite simple, which is there should not be tuition fees. Now, I suppose just one other point then is at the moment, you know, we've got people at university. The universities are not providing direct face-to-face education for perfectly understandable reasons. But the problem is the students are having to rent flats or accommodation, but yeah, there's no point in taking up the accommodation since it's remote learning, and they're being made to pay for things which is not of little use to them in many cases. So it's my solidarity with those students who are on strike, refusing to pay the rent. And I support them entirely, and that you will find there are other left MPs who share the same view. Now, sorry to speak for a while, but I wanted just to give a kind of context to where we are and what happened back in the 90s.
I think it's really interesting. Thanks for starting us off with that, John, because there obviously it is a complicated debate and we have to consider it from all of those different angles. But the follow-on from that is that change in relationship, the nature of student to education, the marketisation that has occurred, has transformed so many of the arguments around that as well, which I hope we're going to come on to cover now. Like, would we have made the same decisions about students going back to university if there wasn't that financial incentive, not just for the universities competing against each other, but landlords, local businesses, and all of the ongoing economic issues? So I think that's a fantastic place for us to start. Do you think, listening to John speak there from the perspective of a worker in education, how does that kind of reflect on your views? Can you see that things have transformed since students have had to pay fees, and is it for the good?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, John was talking about the late 90s then. I was 17 in 1997 when Blair got in, and I was part of, I suppose, the students who were protesting and marching and so on against the introduction of tuition fees. I didn't actually pay tuition fees because my family were below the income threshold, so things have changed even since then. In that now, obviously, rather than £1,000 a year, £3,000 over 3 years, we're looking at 30, 40 grand's worth of debt universally to all students, which unfortunately Blair put the foot in the door to allow all of that through. And we fast forward 22 years, it's created absolute chaos. I mean, I would say that certainly, going to your point, Jen, we would not be in this situation without a marketised model of universities. I think competition for students meant that universities made absolutely impossible promises that they knew at the top there was only some chance of them being able to fulfil, depending on how the pandemic developed. It pitted pre-92s against universities like mine, the former polytechnics, post-92s in terms of competing for students. I think in terms of the issue of class, there's been a lot of complexity around class in terms of what has happened and the narrative over universities and face-to-face learning. It's absolutely true that it's working class students who are going to struggle most with the situation of learning at home because of the failure of our government to resource online learning, because of the failure of our government to actually give a proper welfare system where people have suitable living conditions and so on. And there's been terrible treatment of students living in halls of residence, but for a lot of working class students, they're not living there, they're living at home in multi-generational families with kids, with partners who are working in low-paid jobs and so on, and the mingling of that across the university sector. I mean, when we look at the figures alongside schools, I would say that the decision by the government to leave universities to compete against each other with students with these impossible promises has actually driven the second wave. And while a failure to resource home learning has caused big problems for working class students, second wave has absolutely slaughtered working class people. It has led working class people to their deaths. And that our government and university leaders absolutely have to take account of that. And we have to look at how we now change this system. I've seen a lot of campaigns for fees to be refunded. I certainly think that we need to look at fees. I think we need to be more radical with that and say now is the time to end fees. The situation that we have this year is entirely down to a rampant marketised sector which doesn't look at students as human beings all on different journeys and going through the process of education. We really need to think as well alongside universities about further education, think about how actually we have a huge workforce of people who are there ready and able to level people up who have experienced disadvantage. We've got probably 12 cohorts of school kids who have had all really different experiences of home learning and being in and out of school. We need a big push to fund further education as well, I would say.
Yeah, I think there's one thing that's just worth bringing out from what Rhiannon's just said, which is, and this is partly what I said, if at the beginning there was a cap and an equality between all universities, I think it was £3,000, and that was it. I said to Blair at that time that he's opening the door to a complete marketisation where some profits would make money, universities would make profits, others would make loss. You'd end up with bankruptcies or takeovers, monopoly kind of situations. It was creating a private monopoly. Now, of course, as soon as the Tories got in, they did what was obvious was the next step, which was you raised the cap and you allowed different universities to charge different sums for different courses. Now, once you do that, you're a family. Your pride and joy, you're Sandra, the granddaughter, whatever she might be, first chance ever for somebody in your family to go to university. You look at all the university courses, let's say she's doing chemistry or physics or whatever, engineering, they'll go to the cheapest, but not necessarily the one which is best adapted to young Sandra's needs. I'm imagining Sandra, by the way. But so this actually leads to a downward spiral in the quality of what's being provided. And again, it comes back to this question of, is this a marketplace? Is it really a marketplace when the best brains in the country at 16, 17, 18-year-olds are forced to make choices driven purely by the financial situation of themselves, the family and their prospects? But that's what's happened. And I find it revolting, and I think most ordinary people would think the same, but somehow it's just got the government, Tory and New Labour both got away with it.
Yeah, it's an absolute disgrace, isn't it? Actually, talking about the government, John, I wanted to ask you, so do you, from your perspective, watching the government in Parliament, do you think that they fully considered all of the implications of expecting students to go back in September? Or was
you mean under COVID?
Yeah.
I don't think they thought about it. I think we've got a government that doesn't understand the lives of ordinary people and doesn't even want to understand the lives of so many people. But it's not as if they weren't told, because they have been told. I mean, and I think this question has to be posed to the leadership of our party, our movement, the Labour movement, about where we think we're going in relation to all this too, because, you know, if you want to build an inclusive society, which supposedly we do, and one that's socially coherent, where there's not these deep divisions between haves and have-nots, kind of, to use a hackneyed phrase, you know, we can't go on with the university education in this way. And in any event, if as a country we want to just develop the best minds to make the greatest contribution to our society, even in the narrow economic terms, this is not going to achieve it, is it? And what we've got instead is a generation now left behind, generation facing financial problems and emotional and mental health problems, which they don't give an F about, quite frankly, of this government. They don't understand it. They don't want to understand it. They don't give a damn, basically. And so I don't think they'd even thought it through. But I did notice the other day that the Prime Minister did say he was going to make a statement, further statement about residential fees for students. Well, it hasn't emerged yet, has it? But maybe some of the Tory voters and the Tory party members have got grandkids themselves are now on the threshold of kind of getting into difficulties. So who knows what pressures are inside the Tory party. The only thing we can do is make a case for a completely different world, which is a one which we don't even need to imagine. It's one which we can immediately evoke, and I think would find a big response amongst ordinary folk. Whether our leadership gets on with that or not, I don't know, but we have to.
Absolutely, and that's why I'm so pleased to be joined by two young, amazing activists as well. So, Fraser, do you want to come in and tell us a little bit about what you've been doing?
Hi, yeah. So I am a student activist at the University of Warwick, and I'm also one of the Young Labour student reps. So at Warwick, we've been organising a rent strike in response to the way the university's treated us this year. And also as Young Labour student rep, I've been kind of producing some resources, training resources on how to organise a rent strike, and kind of supporting Labour clubs across the country to do that. I did kind of want to come in on some of what John said, because I thought it was really interesting. And I think it's definitely no coincidence that the point at which more working class young people get access to university is also the point at which it becomes marketized, and the point at which you have to accrue huge amounts of debt in order to access it. And that debt then also has the effect of weakening your bargaining position in the workplace, because you have to meet these debt payments, you know, you're not in as secure a position. And I think that kind of system of marketization, kind of as Rhiannon was saying, kind of almost requires that students were lied to at the beginning of this year, because had the government or universities been honest with students and said, look, there is going to face-to-face teaching isn't going to be able to happen. There are going to be COVID outbreaks in the absence of a test and trace system. Well, then students would have deferred the year. They wouldn't have signed accommodation contracts, and universities would be facing massive financial black holes, especially those universities that broke the line and said, oh, you know, and so instead you had this like massive campaign. You had vice chancellors doing videos being like, the university is safe, walking around campuses being, look at all the hand sanitizer and the lines and the dots, everything's fine, come back to university, it's going to be a great year. So students signed their accommodation contracts and they paid their tuition fees. And if the government hadn't done that, you know, the universities would face a massive financial black hole. And I think there would have had to be a bailout. There would have had to be a government intervention. And the whole lie that that universities are private business institutions would have collapsed. It would have been proven to be a massive policy failure. It would have, the whole system of marketization would have been shown completely irresilient in the face of crisis. And that would have, I think, kind of repoliticized the issue of higher education and how it's funded and what it's for. And the Conservative government was just never going to allow that to happen. So I think in some ways this crisis was kind of inevitable within a marketized system of higher education. And I do think that while a lot of what's motivating the current round of rent strikes is this anger at like we're not getting what we paid for, what we were promised, there is also a deeper sense, a deeper disillusion with the whole education system, the higher education system, and a sense that it just treats students as revenue streams. It doesn't treat us as people. Our education has become a product. I mean, from the students I know at work, nobody trusts our institution. Nobody believes the university cares about us, you know. And every single, I think what COVID's done is just exacerbated a series of pre-existing crises at universities, whether that's the mental health crisis, because the way that the labour market is now in universities there's this climate of anxiety about you need to get a good degree, you need to be able to sell yourself in the labour market. And that's been worsened. Most students depend on work to cover the cost of their studies now. And obviously there's been massive unemployment among students during this crisis. And even before, lots of students had to depend on very insecure work, and that's been exacerbated. So I think that this is the crisis. Every crisis is also a political opportunity. And I think that the Labour movement, the Labour Party, has an opportunity to point out and to draw the connections between this crisis and a system of education run on market lines. And to instead propose a different free public education system. And I don't think that opportunity is really being grasped as it could be.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, excellent points there. Thank you for that phrase. And I think you're totally spot on, and it's interesting to hear you mention the Conservatives' response in terms of they wouldn't want to have allowed things to be any different in September, simply to keep the lid on the system that they've got, because as you've so well articulated, there are so many problems with the current system and they don't want that to change, do they? So that is also, it's quite shocking to consider it from that perspective, but very true, I'm sure. Finlay, do you want to come in on some of the points that have been raised so far? I'd love to hear more about what you're doing too.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. I completely agree with Fraser in that this is very much an opportunity for sort of us on the left, because ultimately this is, while there is issues that have risen their head perhaps as within the COVID crisis, these are, as you said, issues fundamentally with the neoliberal university institution, and it's only taken COVID for us to realise that actually vice chancellors don't care about us at all. We've even got, obviously, with it's quite a difficult situation that we're in, because we're obviously being sold a commodity that is not worth what we're paying for it. But ultimately we're also making the argument that it shouldn't even be a commodity at all. So it's like we're being put into a market which we don't want to be in by chance, but we're even getting ripped off then. Because we're paying £9,000 for Zoom, but we know that face-to-face teaching can't go on. And what's something that's been really awful here, we've been speaking to sort of our UCU, and what our VC is basically trying to pit the students and staff against each other, and say that the students are angry because the teaching quality isn't good enough. We're not being given the facilities that we need to access with that. But that's not the staff's fault. They weren't given adequate training. It's not their fault for COVID. We need to be standing with our staff, and that's something that we're really looking to go forward with. Sort of UCU student solidarity there. Ultimately, I think that it's that issue of the commodity of education that just makes it so inaccessible for so many people. I mean, for example, at the moment, one of the things that has sort of been pushed forward by our vice chancellor to sort of quell the rent strike a bit, because they are quite scared of us, I think, is that they're giving rent rebates for everyone that isn't back at university. But when you look at the people that have had to come back, those are often sort of working class people with mental health issues. I know someone that had to come back because their parents are so homophobic that it wouldn't have been safe for them to be at home. So it very much divides the student movement that was in such good force before. And I think that while it's definitely going to be something that we've got to get over, I think that the students are quite in a strong position at the moment, because obviously when you do marketize something, all it takes is for someone to not pay for it, and then it suddenly fails to function as a commodity as well. But yeah, brilliant.
Very good.
Yeah, thank you very much, Finlay. It's really it's interesting to consider, isn't it? They take the lid off the bottle, make you pay, and then they're going to have to face the consequences of that as well. When students are really incredibly realising their power across the country right now and exercising that right. But in the meantime, I am really concerned about that kind of pressure that it's putting on so many different individuals. And like you said, the desperate circumstances that so many people live in, and always comes back to affecting the working class more, doesn't it? I know you've covered this a little bit already, John, but did you want to come back on some of those class issues that we're seeing now because of education?
Yeah, well, you know, I've felt this all my life, by the way. The centrality of class in our society, though we know there are many forms of oppression to, you know, whether it's gender, race, and ethnicity, or sexuality, and so on and so forth. There are many, but I don't want to say underlying, but alongside and perhaps underlying all of those is the class nature of the society we inhabit. And of course, the whole purpose of what we call neoliberalism has been to enhance the power and wealth of the ruling class at the expense of everybody else. And so, as you would expect, the reforms which have taken place in higher education simply have reinforced the divisions which exist. It's also about developing something else, which is an ethos in society of you look after yourself and nobody else. Is a sort of selfish, rather than a caring, altruistic ethic, which is what should exist and which does exist in many poorer communities where literally you do have to look after each other if you want to survive. And I'm a building worker by trade, and if I was working on a roof, I required the people around me to watch my back, and I did the same with them. So the ethos of solidarity is a strong one, but they're trying to destroy it. Now, I just want to recall, as I can't stay to the very end of the conversation, but I've been around a long time now. I remember quite clearly the student movement in the late 1960s, and particularly the action at the LSE, which has become a completely different institution now to what it was. But what happened there was a complete, the students occupied the university. We can't do that in the middle of COVID, so that's a problem for us. And then I went to Hull University as an adult student, and the same thing, we had an occupation there. In our case, we wanted to get the university to divest from its investments in apartheid. The LSE example, though, I think is interesting because the students said, you know what, we don't want to even learn some of the courses you've been teaching us because it's crap, basically. It's the status quo, establishment stuff. We want to hear things different. So the man who became later my mentor was a guy called Ralph Miliband, who you will have heard of. And he then began to give free lectures in Marxism and socialism and economic history, and other university lecturers joined him. And there were massive crowds of students drawn in during that occupation to learn about different ways of seeing the world than the ones that they were being taught by the conventional lecturers. Well, it frightened the establishment to death, actually, and various actions were taken, including sacking staff and so on and so forth. However, you know, student movements can be incredibly successful if they learn the working class values, solidarity and collective action. So just to bring it back to class for a second, I don't think I completely answered the question you asked me, but I wanted just to mention that because what's encouraging is this movement. And, you know, I think we can talk about rents, we can talk about tuition fees, but it's got to be provided into a bigger context because this is about two visions, two contending views of the world, one of which is an ethos, a social ethos, and the other one which is a privatized, narrow, individualist, the law of the jungle ethos. And we stand in one place. Now, I think the students, obviously not many of them are that political, but we have to show them this is part of a wider struggle for the kind of society and the kind of future we want for our country and for the world too. And I think there's a chance now because of COVID has revealed all of those problems, the fissures in society, which existed all along, but which were hidden by the media and so on. So I think this is a very exciting time. I totally get what the students are saying, would like to see them raising this. If they can work together with the university lecturers, that's excellent too. At the end of the day, it's the vice chancellors, and they do have a duty to the students, not a financial duty, but a duty of care. And they themselves ought to come under pressure to be told. They have to go back to the government and say, this is damaging the young people to whom we have a duty of care. And that will mean direct pressure on the vice chancellors and the administrations. But I do have to go. So I'm going to just wish you all very well. I'll be watching any actions by the UCU, by the students up and down the country. And if we can offer support from the left inside the Labour Party, PLP, we will offer solidarity. But my final point is this, the old phrase I learned from my granddad, put not thy faith in leaders. In the end, it's only the rank and file, it's the ordinary people, the workers, the students, and others who can make the change. Us as MPs can give you support, but that's got to be done, from the grassroots up. Thanks very much. I'm sorry I've talked more than I should have done, but anyhow.
Not at all. It's been brilliant. Thanks, John. And we appreciate your time. And like you, I'm very pleased to be joined by our future.
Absolutely. Great to see your new generation. Great to see your new generation.
All right. Cheers, John.
See you, comrades.
So, Finley, did you want to come back in on some of the things that John was saying there?
Yeah, I'd love to if that's okay. One of the things that he sort of brought up there was that the students are quite depoliticized, and sort of in my time in lockdown, I've been reading quite a bit about sort of how students have become quite depoliticized, and what I think is sort of happening now under sort of the COVID crisis, especially because people are, they've been laid out of their jobs, furlough's been sort of in the balance the whole time, and we've now been dragged to university to ultimately be very blatantly exploited, is that I think a lot of students are becoming quite radicalized by this experience. I mean, even for example, where we had a protest that was meant to be going ahead on campus, that then was completely locked off by the police because they threatened fines for everyone. And obviously fines are such a problematic issue because they target the working class more, because for a wealthy student who throws a party and gets a £10,000 fine, if they're able to pay that off, then that's nothing. But for most students, that would completely cripple them. But so it was completely locked off, and then there was police literally everywhere that were threatening to hand out fines for people on their doorstep, banging pots and pans in replacement for that protest. And even that experience there just showed quite a lot of people how the police were a weapon of repressing us as opposed to sort of protecting us. And now we've got sort of quite a consciousness on campus that the police are not here to protect us in all forms. So I think completely, while the students may not be completely political at the moment, I think it is very quickly becoming quite a politicized cohort. I think a lot of people are very aware that these issues do completely stem from capitalism, and that there is an alternative in that, and that is socialist politics and socialism as a concept. I'd like to also talk about what he said about vice chancellors, because one of the things that we're doing, because obviously we are sort of forced to operate within the systems that we are given by the university, is that we're running a referendum for a vote of no confidence in our vice chancellor. There was a similar one that was done by the UCU, and that came out a ridiculous percentage, like 93 or something like that. But we're running one of those with our students to basically say that obviously they are intended to serve us, and if the overwhelming majority of students don't think that they serve us as a body, then what's she doing at the top? Because all the time she's consistently had just scandal after scandal, going on national television, lying about writing a letter to a student that was racially profiled on campus. There's no confidence in her, and what we'd look to do from there is a more democratic system to sort of have sort of almost operate like the Senate perhaps. But yeah, that sort of idea that the vice chancellors are and the senior management are the exploitative powers is very ringing true at the moment. But also, again, to sort of bring it back to that politicization of students are very aware that it's the vice chancellors and the senior management that are exploiting us there.
And it's brilliant to hear you holding them to account like that as well. Thank you, Finley. Fraser, did you want to come in and answer some of those points that John raised too?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think the biggest con of marketization is pitting students and staff against each other and trying to make students understand their experiences, trying to like get something off the staff or get the commodity that they paid for. I think so. One of the things that's happening with the student strikes is we're forming a national network with a rep from most of the strikes, and we're going to kind of use that to encourage political education, and kind of encourage students to see this as like a collective struggle in solidarity with workers. And I think, like Finley was saying, what we're calling for, one of the ultimate solutions, is that our institutions should be governed by the workers and students that make them run. It's the classic socialist case to democratize society, that the people that produce and make up institutions are the people that should have control over them. I also wanted to pick up on what John was saying, which I thought was really interesting, about how students at LSE in the 60s complained that they didn't even want to be taught what they were being taught. And I think one of the things that makes the marketization of HE a particular case, maybe, is the fact that higher education, universities, are the places where the kind of dominant ways of seeing the world that then come through the media and everything tend to be produced and reproduced. And the logic according to which universities run also impacts that process. So when we're thinking about the casualization of staff, and how increasingly, so for example, the University of Warwick, when it hires new staff, it often doesn't hire them proper contracts. The terms and conditions are really poor, and it's disproportionately working class staff employed in this way, staff of colour, disproportionately people that are working in the fields of like decolonialism or Marxism, or like critical, the kind of thinking that's kind of critical about the way our society operates. And so this process of marketization is also affecting that, and that's one of the reasons that the ruling class want to marketize higher education, because it has a knock-on impact on the ideas that are seen as legitimate and in society. And I think that you can see that as part of this broader move now, where the government is talking about student unions being too radical, and threatening to cut university funding if student unions become too left-wing. At Warwick, our student union took a very firm line in support of our UCU branch in calling for face-to-face teaching. And in response, the university has still not paid its block grant that it pays every year to the student union as a threat, basically. And obviously, we're also seeing the government talk about trying to ban anti-capitalist teaching in schools, talking about critical race theory and all of this stuff. And especially when the right is really pushing this narrative about this attack on like free speech, I think it's really important to make that point, that actually the reverse is happening, that it's critical thought, it's ideas about working class struggle. These are actually being suppressed, and universities being made into a hostile environment for those kind of ideas.
Thank you, Fraser. That's really interesting. I've been aware, obviously, of the casualisation of education because I've worked in education for such a long time, but I wasn't so aware of how specific that was, different sectors, and how they're also using that as a tool to kind of undermine literally the nation's critical thinking capacities, which is quite appalling. Rhiannon, as somebody that works full-time in education, I'm sure you've got a lot of thoughts to share on these issues. Did you want to come in and answer some of those points?
Yeah, thanks, Jen, and absolute solidarity with the students in all of the efforts you're making. I think the points you're making are really valid in terms of what we're looking at because of marketisation and because of the impact of sort of racial capitalism is a crisis of democracy in our universities, and that does divide staff and students, and it divides between students and between staff and so on. I think in terms of what we do, absolutely, as John was saying, our biggest weapon is to be organised on the grassroots and act in solidarity with each other. And absolutely, UCU stand with all students in rent strikes and taking forms of action against injustice that are being done to them. At Birmingham City University, where I'm branch secretary, we had a situation where in the summer, without consultation, a pledge was made to future students promising 50% of learning would take place face-to-face, without any way of predicting whether the risk would allow for that, what would happen. And this was definitely to do with the competition that we talked about earlier for students. And so we have tried over a very long period of time to reason with management. We've had lots and lots of meetings. Unfortunately, our VC, as soon as we passed the motion to go into dispute, has not attended any of those meetings, but we've had lots of meetings trying to resolve this We went through a consultative ballot. We balloted at the end of December, and that was returned. We beat the anti-trade union threshold, so we now have a live ballot. Events overtook. We got our ballot result the day that Boris took us into a new lockdown. So the immediate threat to a lot of workers of face-to-face mingling and to students is for now on pause, although that doesn't mean that all staff are protected. Professional services staff, support staff often are still on campus, are often doing work that could be done remotely. And so we really need to stand with those staff who tend to be the poorest paid staff as well, and that's part of what we're trying to resolve in our dispute. The big issue now is that we are very concerned that there will be an unsafe return forced back because of the promises they made, like the 50% pledge at Birmingham City University. Vice Chancellors are terrified that they're going to get into trouble with the Office for Students, that they're going to end up with the kind of black holes that the students mentioned in their finances. And I think they will do anything and everything across the UK to push people back. Joe Grady, the UCU General Secretary, said yesterday that we will be ready to ballot branches against unsafe returns. I'm very pleased that our branch has sort of got a front foot on this because our ballot is already live. We're meeting with leadership this week. We hope that they will now, seeing the strength of democracy behind us, come into reasonable negotiation to say that a return will be agreed on what we mutually see as safe. If that doesn't happen, we will be serving notice for action short of a strike, meaning that we will be remaining online if a return to campus is forced. In terms of the points about class that John was just making, absolutely class is a unifying factor. I think it's important to see that class is something which is also intersectional in terms of how this pandemic is panning out. I think it was you, Finlay, who mentioned the particular risk for some LGBT students of the home environment. The home environment is a real crisis point for a lot of women at the moment. Jen, I imagine you've got sympathy for this, in that in absolute solidarity with the NEU, our kids should not be in school. We should not be throwing teachers under the bus for the sake of keeping the economy running. But we need to really take it to our employers to say that home learning at the same time as working full-time from home is not sustainable. There needs to be movement on that to allow for, if necessary, paid leave for workers who are carers, but certainly for flexibility in a way that doesn't see women or other carers missing out. Disability is another big issue in this pandemic. I mentioned that we'd had many meetings. One of the things we were pushing for was for people who had shielding others at home or others who were at high risk at home not to have to work on campus, so that they wouldn't take that risk home with them. We didn't get an agreement on that, unfortunately, though we pushed on it many times. And it seems that leaderships of universities genuinely believe that people can just change their living arrangements when their carers move disabled people out of the household somehow to where, I'm not entirely sure, and that it's the responsibility of the individual. That's to me the opposite of collectivism and democracy and all the things that universities should be standing for as progressive institutions in our society. And lastly, just to come on to some of the points Fraser was making about race, definitely the working class is a racialised class. The death rates of the pandemic have hit Black people hard, very much because, but not only because of the position in which Black people disproportionately make up the working class, and the fact that poverty in a pandemic kills in terms of being forced into work, in terms of where you have to go on public transport, all of those kinds of things. It was interesting that last year we saw the Black Lives Matter movement opening up new spaces for education outside of universities. So, for example, my partner's Black. I won't go into the history, which Jen knows some about, but certainly the victimisation of outspoken Black voices in education is something that we see all around us. So I think spaces that were opened up in our communities, we had gatherings in Dudley, in Stourbridge, in Wolverhampton, near where I live, made a new kind of educational space where people could actually talk about the experience of racism, could have almost sort of family education, kids come along and hear in a supportive environment rather than what's often quite a not supportive environment in the classroom, about colonialism, but also about positive stories about Blackness. And we've seen what Fraser's talking about, I think, a retaliation to that, even though that's outside of institutional educational space, it scared the establishment. It really scared the establishment, and they are massively going to come back on this. I think this thing about schools where they're saying that they're going to go for teachers who use specifically anti-capitalist material, all of these things are a warning shot, and we need very much organised students, organised workers to be ready for this. I suspect they're going to come for strong student voices. They're going to come definitely for trade union activists who are outspoken at the moment, and we need to be very clearly organised and united on these issues.
Wow, thank you for that, Rhiannon. Really powerful contribution there. It's great to hear from you and the stuff that you've been involved with up till now. So Fraser, I want to just come back to you on some of these points, because you mentioned you were putting in place a toolkit that young people can use as a model. And I think following on from Rhiannon's contribution there, it's really important that we give people as much information as we can about our next steps. You know, what are we going to use as part of the next steps in this fight back?
Yeah, the first thing I want to say is absolute solidarity from the National Rent Strike Network and from Young Labour to UCU. At Warwick, we're ready to back our UCU branch in whatever industrial action they take, and as Young Labour, we will do anything we can to support Labour students to mobilise in defence of workers. So you have our full solidarity. I think that that's a really good point. Yeah, so we put together a guide to organising a rent strike, which is on our website, labourstudentreps.com. One of the things, I think it definitely raises a question of how do we go from a movement to organising, and how do we keep students engaged in this post the rent strikes. One of the things I would really like to do at Warwick is help build a student tenants union, and I think that would be something that we're looking at helping people to do across the country. Yeah, I also did want to come in again as well on this kind of double bind of the pandemic, where like the home isn't safe, but also the workplace and the school isn't safe at the same time. And I think that it just shows that we really do need to always bring it back to the Tories' mishandling of the pandemic and not let them get away treating this as an act of nature. You know, plenty of countries have handled COVID-19 without the deaths that we've seen, without the disruption to lives and livelihoods that we've seen. And the reason that this has happened is because we don't have a public health capacity anymore in this country. The austerity stripped it away. You know, we've been seeing the development of zoonotic viruses for the last 40 years, and then public health capacity has stagnated because of the lack of public investment. And I think we really need to repoliticize that and always try and bring it back to that, because these double binds are not natural. You know what I mean? We're only facing these problems because of the mishandling of the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. And that follows really closely from Rhiannon's point, doesn't it? So much of the way this has unfolded has just exposed the problems and the flaws with capitalism, whether it's from the issues of carers being disproportionately affected. It's completely unreasonable to expect people to hold down a full-time job and be carers and just carry on as normal. You can't do that. But we've taken away all of the spare capacity in the system. So we have to change the system. So it's really great to hear from you both on that. So Finlay, I'm sure you must be bursting to come in on some of this as well.
Yeah, I think the main thing I saw with what Fraser said there as well is that sort of we're now faced with sort of perhaps a slightly long sight, but we're now being told that sort of with the vaccine the end is in sight. But we've obviously seen all of these crises and fissures evolve in the capitalist system as a result of COVID, and I think that something that is really important as sort of the left is appealing to the masses who may have previously not as been engaged. A massive part of this with our own campaign, and we were talking about how when we went on rent strike in September for our first term, it wasn't known, it wasn't cool to be on rent strike, whereas now we've come off the back of a massive victory. Students have been given sort of £600 to £1,000 in a rent rebate, and suddenly it's really cool to be on rent strike. That's a big thing, and I think that we need to keep forward that appeal to the average person, because the average person doesn't want to sit through and read marks like that. It's not fun. I've done it, I enjoy it, but I'm weird. And I think that we need to definitely appeal for that, and I think that definitely a criticism that can be levelled at the current leadership of the Labour Party. I mean, if you look back to 2017, you had sort of stuff like Grime for Corbyn, which was massive. I mean, when you look at the sort of the a lot of the victories that were made there, it wasn't made by Labour campaigning as such. It was made by people going, you know, it's a normal person. And I don't think that you could ever see a Grime for Keir Starmer movement, because he's not as engaging with the masses. And I think that regardless of whatever's going on within the Labour Party, I think that we need to have that position where there could be a Grime for rent strikes or whatever for rent strikes. There needs to be that student movement that is students as a collective, not as a radical group of left-wing students that all sit around and read theory to each other, and then there's like 10 of them and they go and do an occupation or something like that. There needs to be students together who are all collectively angry about the way that the capitalist system functions, and it needs to be engaging for the masses, not just for the people. When we say for the many, not for the few, that does apply in who we appeal to as well, not just who our policies work for.
Yeah, 100%. It's so important, isn't it? What you're doing is incredible, and we need to get that message out there. This is students fighting back all over the place in a way that can be replicated and absolutely must, to keep pushing this point. And I do agree, sadly, with what you're saying about the approach from the Labour leadership. So I think any movement is at its strongest when it listens to all of its strands, and it's a vital part of the national conversation of what's happening right now. Students are a part of that education, you know, the teachers, university lecturers, they're a vital part of that, and we need to get that included more, I think, in the ideas that are coming out from the Labour leadership. So hopefully they're tuning into this. So I'm going to go to each of you now for a quick final thought, like reflecting on anything we've spoken, or a message that you've got for people listening on where they should be taking this next. Sorry to drop you in on this, Rhiannon, but hopefully you can come in first and I'll go to each of the lads in turn.
Yeah, I would say definitely, just to reiterate really the point that we're strongest when we are all standing collectively together, students with workers, recognising all the different types of people who are affected by the current disaster capitalism scenario that we're facing, I suppose. But I think as well there's an important trade union saying, I think it's Bob Crow, which is if you fight, you might lose. But if you don't fight, you're definitely going to lose. And I think we're at this point, whether you're a moderate student trade unionist, whether you are militants, whether you're somewhere in between, I don't think there is anything other than disaster waiting without an organised, really strong collective movement. So solidarity, and let's all stand together and let's fight.
That's excellent, thank you. And I think you're totally spot on. It doesn't matter where somebody's coming from. To this point, they might have seen themselves as a moderate up until now, but right now we've got to reassess, and we've got to look at the actual effects this pandemic is having on people, and the disproportionate effects it's having on people, and how we are responding. And it's about fairness and justice, and that should be a great leveler for everybody to be considering now, and how we start to change and get more radical, I think, in our response. So Fraser, have you got a final thought that you would like to share with everyone out there?
I think the takeaway message is like, we need to be clear that this crisis is a crisis of universities run on market logic, and we need to, as students and staff, we need to organise collectively together, withdraw our rents, withdraw our labour, and we need to fight and win a public and democratic education system that is free from fees, free from the interests of the ruling class, free from colonialism, free in every sense.
Excellent. I think my takeaway from this, actually, from listening to you all, is going to be the ideas and the solidarity has kind of re-inspired me to know that's going on so much out there. And I hope everyone else is taking that too. So Finlay, over to you. What would your final takeaway points be?
Yeah, I mean, as I said sort of near the end there, that I think that we're now sort of reaching the point where we're arguably the worst of the pandemic, but the vaccine's sort of being rolled out, and hopefully, provided the Tories don't balls it up too much, the end is sort of within sight. But I think that with the transition from sort of, as sort of Rhiannon said, disaster capitalism, from disaster to disaster. We need to be transitioning that as the left very smoothly. And obviously, as I said, I'm a nerd that sits around and reads books all day. And when you look at stuff like 1968 in Paris, where that was an extremely radical movement led by students, and where that failed is often laid to the fact that the workers and the students felt very disconnected. And I think that's what's extremely different about the situation that we are in now. And when the workers and the students are standing together against this disaster capitalism, as Rihanna once said, not only is the end in sight of the pandemic, but the end is in sight of the Marxist university, and the end is in sight of neoliberal capitalism there as well.
Well, there's a happy thought for us all to go home on. Thank you for that. I just want to say to everybody out there, if you've enjoyed this, do give it a share and leave some comments to let us know what your thoughts and other subjects that you'd like us to consider. If there's stories going on that we haven't heard about that you think need to get some more prominence, please do reply on our Twitter feeds or wherever you're watching this, and let us know your thoughts. I've certainly been really inspired by listening to all three of you, and I think that collective action, if we can replicate that more, we are going to start to see that kind of